Dear friends, from my heart, thank you for joining us to commemorate 10 years of mass atrocities in Syria. My name is Muaz Mustafa, and since the founding of the Syrian Emergency Task Force in 2011, I have served as SETF's Executive Director, leading with our board, advisory board, and staff, a 501c3 dedicated to political, legal, and humanitarian action to support the people of Syria in their quest for democracy, justice, and freedom. 10 years ago, at the start of the ongoing violence that brutalizes society in Syria, I never thought we would be here today, raising awareness of a situation throughout the country, which gets worse with each passing day. In this webinar, we speak to all who accept the responsibility as Americans and human beings to learn more about the moment that we have the determination to call never again. A call that places Syria at the center of action to stop the mass atrocities now. After 10 years, it is time for the world to stop turning a blind eye to the greatest humanitarian tragedy of the early 21st century. In the spirit of this call to action, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Shyamalan, whose words begin our program today.
Hi, my name is Dr. Bhavna Shyamalan, and I am a co-founder of the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation. We support the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which is an organization which provides humanitarian aid and advocacy for people of Syria. In April 2017, I went to visit the Holocaust Memorial Museum with a friend. At the end of the tour, Nadia Fikara, who was taking us on the tour of the museum, took us to the Syrian exhibit, which was at that time a pretty small exhibit of some photos that had been smuggled out of Syria and taken by a man and a photographer codenamed Caesar. At the time, I really did not know much about what was going on about Syria. I'd heard some rumblings in the news about factions fighting factions, and honestly, I felt it was chaotic and complicated, and I didn't really pay much attention. But when I saw those photographs, I knew that this wasn't a war. It had been an extermination of people. And by that time, it was occurring for 6 years, and I had not even known about it. I asked Nadia then, how can I get involved? And she told me about the Syrian Emergency Task Force and its leader, Muaz Mustafa. A year later, I went with Muaz to Turkey to visit and meet with some of the survivors. We just kept hearing stories of so much loss and so much pain. Today, you will see a video put together by Andrea Kalin and her team at Spark Media that is narrated by my husband, M. Night Shyamalan, who went on a journey with me to discover what was happening in Syria. After that, you will be able to hear from voices in Syria, and finally, you'll be able to participate with experts who comprise a panel to talk about how we might end this killing. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here today, because I know that this matters to you. I hope together we might be able to do something for these innocent people of Syria.
We have a foundation and we support leaders from around. Hi, I'm M. Night Shyamalan. And my wife and I, we have a foundation and we support leaders from around the world. And my wife went to the Holocaust Museum and she came back and said, hey, I want to support this leader. His name is Muaz Mustafa, and he runs an organization called the Syrian Emergency Task Force, and they do work in Syria. And she started to tell me what they do, and I said, wait, I'm hesitant about Syria. I don't know if our foundation should get involved in it. That seems like a really messy thing. And I was reacting to something. I was reacting to a narrative that had been told to me over and over again, and I didn't realize it. It was a narrative that there was a civil war going on in Syria that was so messy and so violent and so entrenched, there was no way that you could get involved in that area. But I just realized that I was being told a story by somebody. Who was that somebody? Now, here's the thing. I make movies, and We try very hard to pull the storyline out that is the most connected to the audience, the thing that will make you come to the movie theaters. That's the story we try to pull out and tell you and say, hey, this is the movie. This is the story. And then you feel connected to that story and then you come to the movie. Well, in this case, the person telling the story wants just the opposite. They don't want you to come. They don't want you to get involved. So the person telling me the story of Syria is telling me a story so that I have that reaction, so that I don't want to get involved. And the person telling the story is Assad. And he's telling me the story of this violent, messy civil war that I should stay away from. But really, after learning what's actually happening in Syria, I realized there's an actual amazing story underneath it all that I'm very, very connected to. And this is the story I want to talk to you about. It was children that start this story. These children, inspired by us, inspired by America, went and spray painted on a wall the words freedom and your turn's next, doctor, referring to Assad. They were arrested. These children were tortured. And more protests rose, and more children protested. The country as a whole started to rise up. You had one city, then another, and then another. And they faced the military with flowers, and it was peaceful protests for as long as they could go. Our opinion was turning against Assad. So much so, it was inevitable it was going to end with the toppling of the dictator, and that's where it should have ended. Assad started telling his story to avoid the narrative of a group of families and children fighting for freedom to not get to us, to not get to the world. He immediately painted them as Muslim radicals and began the story of the civil war in Syria, because eventually he would have been toppled. And things could have worked out in the way that it should have if Russia hadn't gotten involved and Iran hadn't gotten involved. Both of them got involved for their own reasons. None of them good. Then ISIS sees a vacuum in all of this mess and decides to come into Syria. And Assad loves this. He loves this because now he can tell the Western world he's fighting our enemy. And that creates even more confusion in the mix. And so this story of this messy civil war is now entrenched, and the world steps away. Atrocities are happening on a scale we can't imagine, and people are getting slaughtered. Here we are, 10 years later. And how did this never again moment happen? How is it still going on? Well, it's because of the story that we were told. We shouldn't forget about the real story, about children fighting for freedom. Children have disappeared. I had gotten a chance to spend time with Caesar, who was a police photographer who took all the photos took 50,000 photos of victims of Assad's torture and brought them out of the country to show the world. And as I sat here, he actually showed it to me in this room, I was chilled and moved, and I felt very much connected to those kids, that their story was my story. The story of my dad coming to America here to start a new life, to dream about freedom for himself and his family, that they were dreaming the same dreams. Those kids could be me. They actually even looked like me. I felt very connected to them. I live in Philadelphia, the home of the Liberty Bell and the Declaration of Independence, those symbols of American democracy. And I see in the Syrian people, even after 10 years of atrocities, I see in them that spirit, that wish for democracy that defines America. I see them as an extension of our story, and our story and their story are interlaced. People fighting for freedom and democracy. And children started it. We inspired those children, and those children should inspire us right back. That's not a complicated story to hold on to. Children fighting for freedom.
And now I would like to introduce Rasha, the director of a women's center that is supported by American communities in Idlib province in the midst of 1,270 IDP camps.
باستنجاح السوري الممتد على مدى 10 سنوات أو أكثر، وباسم مئات الآلاف من المعتقلين والملايين من المهجرين، نتوجه إلى صناع القرار في هذا العالم، وعلى رأسهم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ممثلة بالرئيس الأمريكي جو بايدن وبأعضاء المجلس الشعبي والنواب. نحدثكم اليوم صادرين على الجراح، في حين أريد لنا بعد 10 سنوات الصمت والهلاك، لكننا لازلنا نصنع الحياة أينما حللنا. تحملنا التهجير والاقتلاع من الأرض، وتعايشنا مع أصوات القصف ورائحة الموت. اليوم نضعكم في سؤال يختبر إنسانيتكم. ما هو موقفكم تجاه 4 ملايين إنسان يقطنون بقعة جغرافية مهددة بالانحسار يوما بعد يوم إثر ضربات العصابة الممثلة بإيران وروسيا والنظام السوري؟ إن صمتكم وتخاذلكم وعدم اتخاذ قرار حاسم من شأنه أن يعرض هؤلاء لمذبحة لم يشهد لها التاريخ مثالا، أو في أفضل الأحوال سيتحولون إلى مهاجرين لن تستوعب لهم لا بلاد القارة الأوروبية ولا أمريكا. فهذا نضعه أمامكم وننتظر منكم إنصاف هذا الشعب.
I would like to introduce now a young teacher and principal of the Wisdom House School for Orphans, also supported by American communities. Her video comes from Aleppo.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أحمد الله أن وفقني أن أرسل صوتي وصوت جميع السوريين عامة وصوت الأطفال خاصة إليكم أيها الشعب الأمريكي عامة وأعضاء الكونغرس والبيت الأبيض خاصة. وآمل أن تصل رسالتي إليك سيدي الرئيس بايدن وإليك سيدتي الدكتورة جيل بايدن التي سمعت أنك معلمة مثلي. وبعد أقول إليكم يا من جلستم تستمعون كلامي وتنصتون لحديثي، كونوا مع السوريين. أنقذوا أطفالنا من التشرد والضياع، أوقفوا إراقة الدماء، ساعدونا في نشر الأمن والسلام. مطلبنا كان مجرد حلم بالحرية، نريد أن يصبح حقيقة، ولكنه انقلب إلى كابوس بشع عاد بالبؤس والتشرد على من فقد منزله وبالموت والهلاك، على من دخل سجون السفاح بشار الأسد، وبالجهل والخوف والشعور بعدم الأمان على الفئة التي هم الفئة الأهم الأطفال. فكم هو حزين وأنا أو أي معلم يعطي درسه ويكون طلابه منسجمين معه في الدرس يغنون ويكتبون، وإذ بصاروخ طائرة يفجع المدرسة كاملة، فذاك يبدو جريحا وهذا قتيلا وهذه المعلمة حائرة على ماذا تبكي؟ على أولادها الذين قطعت أيديهم أو أرجلهم أو رؤوسهم؟ أم تبكي على درسها الذي كانت سوف ترى النجاح فيه بنجاح طلابها؟ فمن هنا أقول لكم أيها الشعب الأمريكي العظيم، شكراً وألف شكر لكل من وقف بجانبنا وأرسل إلينا رسائل الأمل التي دائماً تبث فينا الأمل. ونطالب الحكومة الأمريكية بحظر جوي وحماية ما تبقى من أرواحنا وأجسادنا التي كانت فقط تريد الحرية والكرامة فقوبلت بالضرب والقتل والتشرد. مطالبنا إلى الآن الحرية وإزاحة بشار الأسد عن الحكم والعودة إلى بيوتنا التي تهفو قلوبنا إليها. وشكرا.
We will now play a video that was sent to us by the people of Rukban, an IDP camp in southern Syria.
السلام عليكم يا سيدي يا اخواتي، تعرفوا كل حالة هم مخيم ضعيفين وعلى الله وعليكم يا سيد تعرفوا والله يحب خبز ومي وشيء يعني هيك قليل ثاني بركة الخبز ما مطولها وفتت هالإنسان كيف هالعيالنا ما معنا والله يا سيد تعرف انت يعني وعندنا يا معاقب تعرف على قد الحال والله.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. احنا هون في مخيم الركبان حاصرين، لا أدوية لا قوت لا حليب لهالأطفال، مواد غذائية، مواد أطباء خالص يعني لا طبابة لا أدوية، كل شيء ما في موجود عندنا. بنتي عمرها 4 شهور 5 شهور، كل شلون حلتها لا حليب لا إشي، يعني بدنا حليب بدنا أدوية لهالأطفال، بدنا احنا الكبار مرضانين يعني لا دواء ولا الخلط لا شيء مرضانين يعني وما في وسيله اننا يعني نشتري ادويه وبالنار وما في موجود شيء والله كثير حالتنا سيئه بهالمخيم. يا اهل الخير اللي بي الله يجزيكم الله يجزيكم الخير اللي تقدروا عليه ابعثوا لنا اياه، يعني اطفالنا والله نشفت لا ادويه لا حليب لا شيء. ويعطيكم العافيه.
واحنا مستشرين خير منكم خير ونريد منكم ماي ونريد.
And from Deir Zor, I would like to introduce a video by Dr. Ghassan Youssef, the head of the Deir Zor Council.
غسان اليوسف رئيس الحكومة المحلية بمنطقة دير الزور، هاي المنطقة الاستراتيجية بسوريا حيث تتواجد قوات التحالف الدولي وعلى رأسها القوات الأمريكية، حيث بنينا شراكة فاعلة نحن والقوات الأمريكية وقوات التحالف الدولي من أجل القضاء على داعش الإرهابي الذي خطره كان يهدد جميع أنحاء دول العالم. وكانت دير الزور هي آخر معاقل التنظيمات الإرهابية، ولا زال داعش فعال بشكل كبير بالمناطق بدير الزور والمناطق المحيطة بها. والقضاء على داعش يحتاج مزيد من الوقت ومزيد من الجهد بكافة الأصعدة. القضاء على داعش يحتاج مزيد من الوقت بكافة الأصعدة، وأن عملية الاستقرار بهذه المناطق بسوريا تحتاج إلى دعم كبير من قوة التحالف الدولي وعلى رأسها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية من عدة جوانب، وأهمها الجانب العسكري والأمني، استمرار العمليات العسكرية والأمنية للقضاء على داعش، بالإضافة إلى جهود إعادة الإعمار والجهود الاقتصادية، وهي أحد الأسباب الأساسية لاستقرار المجتمعات المحلية بمناطق دير الزور ومناطق شمال وشرق سوريا. كذلك عملية الاستقرار السياسي والتمثيل السياسي لكل مكونات الشعب السوري وإيجاد حل سياسي عادل للقضية السورية التي استمرت أكثر من 10 سنوات دون وجود حلول. دير الزور هي من المناطق المهمة جدا بسوريا، حيث بالضفة الأخرى بغرب الفرات توجد الميليشيات الإيرانية والنظام والروس، والذين يشكلون خطرا كبيرا على الأمن والاستقرار كذلك بمناطق دير الزور. إن عملية الاستقرار والقضاء على داعش بشكل نهائي تحتاج مزيد من الوقت ودعم كبير جدا من قبل شركائنا بالتحالف الدولي وعلى رأسهم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الذين بنينا معهم علاقة استراتيجية وعلاقة تحالف قوية للقضاء على الإرهاب، حيث قدمنا الآلاف من الشهداء، وقدمنا التضحيات الكبيرة والجسام والمخاطر الكبيرة والتهديدات من الأطراف الموجودة بالمنطقة للقضاء على التنظيمات الإرهابية. نحن نحتاج بهذه المناطق إلى إعادة الإعمار، إلى الاستقرار الاقتصادي، إلى الاستقرار الأمني، حيث لا زال داعش هناك العديد من الخلايا النائمة لداعش تنفذ عمليات إرهابية بكافة مناطق دير الزور. هذا التمثال تقدم إلي من الجنرال جوزيف فوتيل، وهو تعبير عن الشراكة الاستراتيجية مع القوات الأمريكية بالقضاء على التنظيمات الإرهابية. ونستمد من هذا التمثال جورج واشنطن العملية الديمقراطية، حيث كان هذا القائد قائد الثورة هو وزملائه من الأطباء والمحامين بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية يمثلون روح الثورة، ونحن بمناطقنا بسوريا ندعو للحرية والديمقراطية. كذلك جورج واشنطن كان يمثل الحرية ويمثل الديمقراطية للمجتمع الأمريكي، وتلقى مساعدات من قبل الدولة الفرنسية لنجاح الثورة في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. نحن كذلك بسوريا نريد دولة ديمقراطية، دولة متحررة، دولة علمانية تحقق الاستقرار لشعبها بكافة المناطق السورية. لذلك ندعو جميع المسؤولين والفاعلين بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لتقديم الدعم والمساندة لنا كشعب من أجل الحرية ومن أجل السلام.
I would like to now introduce you to a video by the Director of Detainee Affairs for the Syrian Emergency Task Force, Omar al-Shogri.
My name is Omar al-Shogri, and as a child, I was detained alongside my cousins Bashir, Rashad, and Noor in 2012 by the Assad regime forces in Syria. Bashir, because of the torture, could not walk anymore. And that's the story of the last day with him. I was carrying Bashir to the bathroom while the guards on the right side and the left side are torturing me and him. We come to the bathroom, he's there, and I just hear Bashir whispering, saying, "Omar, I can't breathe anymore." I run, carry Bashir on my way back, and the guards keep beating me and him. And at some point, I just felt Bashir's body is heavier, and I was weak. I could not carry him anymore. We fell both on the ground, and Bashir was dead. He died in my arms, and the guards were still beating his dead body. Today, in my nightmares, I still hear Bashir's voice screaming, saying to me, "Omar, help me." I hear those prisoners who are still there being tortured every day. I hear them begging, screaming for help. You and I are the ones who can help. We should take that as a personal responsibility.
And now it's my honor to introduce my friend, Sam Goodwin.
Hi, thank you all for joining today. My name is Sam Goodwin. I was detained on on false charges in Syria in 2019, and I spent the first half of my captivity held in solitary confinement. And during this time, I never saw another inmate, but every day I would hear the sounds of them being beaten in neighboring cells. And these are sounds that I'll never forget. I was later reassigned to a large federal prison and kept with thousands of other Syrians. These men were among the most welcoming, kind, and overall remarkable people I've met anywhere in the world. I remember one evening mentioning to a fellow inmate, "Everyone here is being so nice to me, and it was just hard to expect what you might find in a Syrian prison." And he said, "Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here." Again, words I'll never forget. Thank God, and thanks to countless people who worked tirelessly for my safe release, I'm here today. But many are not. Many are still missing in these horrific conditions. So let this be a reminder that there's always more work to do. I will now read a letter that we were, in somewhat unprecedented fashion, able to obtain from a current Syrian detainee being held in a civilian prison. As kids, we were always told to be patient over the challenges we face, as one day we will turn these challenges into stories to tell our children. And when I was detained, my fellow inmates would always tell me that our only revenge would be to tell our stories. One day, they said. So here I am, taking the only revenge I can get. I write to you today as we approach the 10th anniversary of the uprising and the 9th anniversary of the last kiss I gave to my mother's hands. In 2012, I was told effectively by Syrian intelligence officers that I should remember the day I was detained as my new birthday, and that they would make sure I would want to forget it. They marked the days on my feet, fingernails, and a month's worth of hands. How lucky I am it was only early March. Over the years, I've witnessed death more times than I can count, and I've seen it face to face. We became so familiar with each other, but I always stayed sharp to remember the faces, the names, and the stories behind it to be able to tell it one day to my kids and to the world. In March of 2011, we have decided to break the chains we were born with and to tell those who enslaved us that we were made to be free, and to tell the world, and you who are reading my letter today, that we belong to a world where we are not punished for thinking differently, for demanding dignity and freedom, for wanting a responsible government, and for yearning to walk tall as every being on this earth is meant to. Since I moved here 4 years ago, I was told by the new arrivals that the walls of silence around Syria have been destroyed. I heard about the children who were gassed by sarin in their sleep. I heard about the villages that were destroyed by barrel bombs. I heard about the millions who have flown their children to the sea so they can get a merciful death, better than the one we see here every day. And I heard about the images that you've all seen, the images of those who have cried over the years, the images of those who were luckier than us. So I wonder, as I quickly put this together, why do I write to you what you already know? Why do I write what you already know and what you have already heard? I wonder how many more need to die of torture, of bombardment, and of hopelessness. How many generations would need to continue to live in fear? I know you know the answer. Do not let us down. Now it's my pleasure to welcome the Acting Assistant Secretary of State.
This March marks the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. We join today with our hosts at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to remember all of those who have suffered the brutality of the Assad regime. We honor the many brave Syrians who took to the streets a decade ago and who continue to speak out today to advance human rights, fighting for the freedom and dignity of all Syrians now and for that of future generations. The United States stands with the people of Syria and remains deeply committed to pursuing justice for the victims of the Assad regime's atrocities. We will continue to work with the United Nations, like-minded countries, and Syrian civil society partners like the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which organized this event to pursue accountability and demand the release of the thousands of Syrians who have been arbitrarily detained. Now more than ever, justice and respect for human rights need to be at the forefront of our collective efforts toward a political solution in Syria.
On February 25th, 2011, I sat in the audience at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum at an event honoring the late Congressman Tom Lantos, who survived the Holocaust as a teenager in Hungary. The featured speaker was Vice President Joe Biden, who told a story about his meeting with Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s. He had, upon emerging from the meeting, he gave a press conference, and Vice President Biden said quite famously, when a state engages in atrocity, it forfeits its sovereignty. Retelling the story at the Holocaust Museum years later, Biden recounted that he faced a lot of criticism for making that comment. But he said that the first call he got was from Congressman Lantos, who said, quote, "Keep it up, Joe." Biden was talking about the 1995 genocide of more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. He had no idea, nor did we when he was making those comments, that only 1 month later, the Syrian revolution would begin. And 10 years after that, we would be living in a world that saw over 500,000 innocent people killed, millions of refugees, millions of internally displaced people, tens of thousands of civilians in custody today, being tortured today in Assad's dungeons. We have an expert panel to discuss the path forward, and I'd like to invite them up to the stage now. We have with us today Qutaiba Idlibi, who is the official representative to the United States of the National Coalition for Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. We also have Ambassador Fred Hoff, who teaches at Bard College in New York. He left government in 2012 after serving briefly as an advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on political transition in Syria. And his attempts to mediate peace in 2009 to 2011 between Syria and Israel are the subject of his forthcoming book. And we also have Naomi Kikoler, the director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start with you, Qutaiba. And what we hear in Washington and the conventional wisdom has been is that, oh, Syria, it's so sad, but there's nothing we can do. We have a bias in our policy towards inaction rather than action. And we often tie the options in Syria to some of the failed interventions of years past without recognizing the important differences in the situation today. So let me ask you directly, what does the Syrian opposition want the United States and the international community to do? What is it calling for? What can we do now to help? And what should the objectives be?
Sure thing. Thank you, Josh, and thanks to the Holocaust Museum, the M. Shyamalan Foundation, the Syrian Emergency Task Force, and their partners for putting this together. Today, as Antonio Guterres, the general, said today that Syria is a real nightmare today. And it is a never-ending nightmare throughout the last decade. As we speak today, 80% of the Syrian people are in poverty. Over 12 million people suffer from food insecurity or lack of access to clean water. 2.5 million children are out of school, and over 13 million people are displaced either inside the country or outside the country. And that is more than half of the Syrian people. We are here today, to be honest, because of two promises. One that was made by the Assad regime at the beginning of the uprising in 2011, and that is Assad or we burn the country. And Assad has delivered on that promise. The regime avoided change by using chemical weapons, by using systematic torture, and by indiscriminate bombardment that turned whole cities into rubble and several hundreds, thousands of Syrians dead. The other promise was made by the international community, by the Friends of Syria, and that is to stand by the Syrian people and to support the Syrian people to reach their goal in liberation, in freedom, in democratic country. And we are here today because that promise by the international community has not been fulfilled. What we need to do today, and after 10 years, after so many years in political negotiations in Geneva and Astana and else, we know for sure that the Assad regime is not willing to compromise, is not willing to actually submit to a political solution, is not willing to share any part of power in Syria with anyone else but himself and his family. So the only path forward left for the United States and for the international community is to give leverage for those who actually asked for freedom in 2011, to help the Syrian opposition visualize for the Syrian people what is it like to actually live in a free democratic country. In Syria for so many years, Syrians have not been able to, for so many decades actually, Syrians have not been able to vote their ballots or to go to the ballots. But the only time when they had the opportunity to, they voted with their feet. Over 8 million Syrians today are either in northwestern Syria or in Turkey. Another 4 million in northeast Syria, and another 6 million are somewhere outside in neighboring countries as refugees. All of those people, the majority of the Syrian people, have voted with their feet, and they have chosen not to actually live under the Assad regime. And those people deserve an opportunity, deserve to be given the leverage, deserve to be given the support, so they can actually visualize the vision they had in 2011 in a free and democratic country. So providing this essential support for Syrians, protecting the only enclave they have right now from Assad atrocities, from the bombardment of Russia and Iran, is essential to make sure that this is the leverage we can use against the Assad regime. By actually supporting those actors, by bridging the actors against the Assad regime to actually unify our ranks and be able to support Syrians who actually have came to us and refused to live under the Assad regime. That would require, from the United States to actually engage fully diplomatically and in all other means back into the international community and back into the Syria talks. Throughout the past few years, we have seen continuous decrease in US engagement regarding Syria, diplomatically or otherwise. Millions of people in northern Syria today live without sufficient support because of cut to programs, whether it is to support local councils in northwest Syria or cut to aid coming through OCHA. All of that because of that decrease in US engagement. We need the United States to take back its international role in supporting the international community, in supporting the Syrian people to actually visualize this dream that we went out for in 2011.
Thank you so much. Let's take that question directly to Fred. You've heard what Kutaiba has said. You've heard what they are calling for. Is it something that the United States can lead the international community to achieve? What would be the policy that you see at this moment, not 10 years ago, at this moment, that might have a chance of affecting positive change on the ground? And do you see the Biden administration pursuing any elements of that policy at all?
Well, Josh, first of all, I'm honored to be part of this program. Josh, I think it goes without saying that right now the Biden administration is engaging in a comprehensive interagency policy review about Syria. What do we want? How do we go about getting it? What kind of resources are we willing to put up against it? When you see the daunting list of priorities facing this president, it becomes apparent, notwithstanding all of our collective devotion to the Syrian interest here, it becomes understandable that the administration, would like to find a way to avoid this problem, if at all possible. It's not possible. It's just not possible. Syria's condition now is dire. It's a failed state. It's one where, 18 million Syrians, many of them are looking for ways to get out. If you can envision Assad still being on the scene with his entourage 4 years from now, it means that Syria's status as the North Korea of the Middle East will be thoroughly solidified, and Syria will be a profound threat to the peace in the region and beyond. I think step one for the Biden administration is to recognize the seriousness of the problem, recognize that it impacts on the national security interests of the United States, its allies, its partners, and first make the statement very clearly that the United States is going to adhere to an objective of full political transition in Syria. We need to neutralize quickly these various efforts going on in the region and around the world, to somehow normalize things with Assad. Assad is the death of Syria. There is nothing to normalize. So I hope the administration starts out with a clear statement of its objective.
Let me follow up with you quickly again, Fred. You know, the first inkling we saw of the Biden administration mentioning Syria at all was when the Biden administration decided to bomb a couple of warehouses owned by a couple of Iranian militias who were allegedly involved in an attack on US troops in Iraq. And the Biden team presented this to the American public as a policy measure to lessen the suffering both in Iraq and in Syria. What do you make of that? Do you see that the Syria issue is becoming a sub-piece of the Iran diplomacy, as we saw so many years ago? Do you think this is an alibi for a Syria policy, or do you think it's the beginning of something bigger?
Well, Josh, I'm afraid that more often than not, particularly during the Obama administration, Syria policy was a subset of Iran. President Obama's top priority was to get the nuclear deal, fully understandable. But he came to the conclusion that in order to get to that deal, I must do nothing to upset the Iranians. And that was a profound mistake. I think the most recent strike in northeastern Syria was no more than a response, and I think probably an appropriate one, to an attack on a U.S. facility in Iraq. I think the overall policy towards Syria, and Assad, of course, is in the center of the various policy dilemmas. I think that is still under review, and I would not at this point, based on this one strike, conclude that the Biden administration is boiling down Syria policy to what's happening in the Northeast.
Got it. Thank you. Naomi, if I could go to you. For the last 10 years, I've watched and documented the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's extensive efforts to help preserve and ensure evidence of atrocities and to spread the awareness of these atrocities. I want you to first of all tell our audience why it is that the Holocaust Museum decided, amongst all of the tragedies ongoing in the world, and there are surely many, to focus so much time and attention and resources on the Syrian atrocities, and also talk about what are the broader implications for human rights around the world if these atrocities are not addressed and stopped and punished.
Josh, it's a real honor to be here, but the reality is that we shouldn't have to be here today marking this horrific anniversary. And I think in part, that's part of the answer. The reason that we have become so involved and committed is because, as Kateva, Ambassador Hoff, and everyone who's already spoken has stated, we have been watching crimes unfold before our eyes in vivid detail, but have not seen action taken to protect lives. We've seen the gap between the rhetoric and reality of never again, and I dare say the hypocrisy of that commitment rings so stark in the context of Syria. And if we think about the past decade, it's not just Syria, but Burma and the Rohingyas, China and the Uyghurs, Iraq and the Yazidis. And we can't allow that to become the norm, that we default to almost compassion fatigue, or to, as Ambassador Hoff articulated in his comments, acceptance of invoking all of the reasons why not to act. You know, in real time, these crimes have occurred. We've had ample time. We've had early warning to try to find innovative strategies to prevent and protect. And I really commend Ambassador Hoff and others, notably our Syrian colleagues, for whom the lives of their loved ones and their community rests on their shoulders. They are the heroes when the world has failed to uphold never again. You know, one of the things that we always try to remind people is that, you know, the moral reasons to save lives should be enough. But if we need to articulate all of the other arguments, the geopolitical arguments that can be used to help compel action, Syria is a stark example that shows that, every country can be impacted by the consequences of insufficient action. We've seen refugee flows, regional instability, geopolitical shifts that have helped to contribute to the rise of the far right, informed in part by our failure to act. You know, I went for the museum to Iraq to document the genocide committed by ISIS, in part because of the security vacuum that was allowed to fester in Syria. So sadly, we continue to live in a world where too little action is taken, often too late. And that just doesn't need to be the case. You know, each of you watching through your own actions can support the Syrians that you've met in this event, the organizations working to support them. You can call your members of Congress and say that you believe the US has a responsibility to protect. One of the things that could be done of many is even just simply asking for someone to be appointed to a position similar to what Ambassador Hoff held. And just very briefly, since you mentioned justice, I just want to make two very quick points. The first is that the survivors are not going to give up. There will be no impunity for the crimes committed. We just saw a 95-year-old Frederick Kahlberger deported from Tennessee to Germany to face justice for crimes committed during the Holocaust. And the second is that we can't give up. The testimonies that our Syrian colleagues are sharing, Kiteba, Omar, so many, the photos that Caesar exposed, you know, for them, it often feels like they're shouting into the wind unheard. But we just saw the first case of a perpetrator held accountable for crimes against humanity in Germany. We know that those stories, that evidence is going to make a difference. And I just want to end by just acknowledging one person in particular, Mazen al-Hamada. Years ago, Sarah Afshar made an incredibly powerful documentary called Syria's Disappeared that told Mazen's story of trying to share the horrors of what he endured in Assad's detention facilities with the world. He was central to many of the cases that exist right now in Europe. His efforts are heroic, as are so many of the people who have gone to such great lengths to talk about brutal things that no one should ever have to disclose, just as so many Holocaust survivors, my grandparents included, had to share their experiences to help people truly believe the horrors that so many of us find totally incomprehensible, yet are sadly all too real. And Liz Sly just movingly made public in a recent Washington Post article that Mazen returned to Syria and has been missing for the past year. We don't know where he is, but we do know that his experience, the experience of others, have set in motion a wave of efforts to advance justice that will keep crashing down on the Assad regime and its supporters for decades to come.
Thank you so much. Mazen, who is a friend to many on this panel, is an example of a tragic story. And if you haven't read it, go to the Washington Post and read that story. An activist, a journalist, a survivor. Tragically, he was lured back to Syria by what we believe to be agents of the Assad regime, and it hasn't been heard from since, and we wish him the best. But I'm wondering, just on that point, if I can now bring up to the stage Omar. Omar, are you with us?
Yes, Josh. Hello.
Thank you. So Omar, when I first met you years ago, that was when I became convinced that there's the survivors of the Assad's atrocities will play a crucial role in ensuring justice and accountability, which must come. But tragically, we do not always provide the support for these survivors that they need, and their suffering doesn't end when they are freed. And I'm just wondering if you can share with us your perspective on that important issue and tell our audience what we can do to help survivors like you, like Mazen, and like so many others.
Yes. So my responsibility is to show some hope in the Syrian case, because if we Syrians don't have the hope, nobody else can have it for us. So I try to play this role, and other survivors try to do that as well. We've seen in Mazen's story that survivors are not getting enough support from where they are. It's like now we're talking survivors in the West, in Europe or in the US, they're not receiving this support they need, which is problematic, because any legal prosecutions we're gonna need those people to testify. And when we managed to protect Caesar, we inspired so many survivors to speak up, right? And that's why we managed to have the legal prosecution in Germany that sentenced one war criminal to be in prison for 4.5 years. And one important thing is that those people who've been most productive are those who are still on the ground. So Moaz and I are in touch with a small organization, non-registered organization on the ground in Syria. Few individuals who managed to use the corruption of the Syrian regime to smuggle, to get out more than 90 prisoners. That's much more than what the US government, with all the power they have, managed to get out prisoners of Syria, right? And the thing is, those individuals need to be supported. And if so, those individuals still in Damascus, right? Still in Syria. If we don't protect them, we're gonna lose them, and we not gonna have a way to smuggle any more prisoners. You know how it works in Syria. You pay money, you get things. But now money doesn't have the value as before. So people gotta gather thousands of dollars that they don't have, so they have to prioritize. Should I feed the rest of my kids, or should I pay all the money I have, sell my house to get one of my kids who's suffering inside Syrian detention centers? So the world plays a very important role right now in supporting those, because we didn't, no country yet managed or had enough will to liberate those prisoners. So let's at least support those who survived, who at least work for the justice process for the future. As a Syrian, I know that justice won't be achieved in 1 day or 1 year or 5, but it's important that we keep documenting everything and using the evidence we have. So one day when the regime falls, we can prosecute them, because otherwise the regime is actually targeting. And I told this story before, but the guard who tortured me in prison for 1 year and 9 months called me, and didn't call me to have a nice conversation. He called me to threaten me, to say, if you don't shut up, I'm gonna kill you. And that's your address. And he gave me exactly my address where I live. And I was in Stockholm, in Sweden. And that's like us thinking, oh, should I shut up? If I shut up, the regime will win. If I still speaking, I may be killed. That will be even worse, right? It's like, what should I do in this case? And start thinking about moving to the US. And that wasn't easy. So there's no process that make it easier for survivors to speak up at the same time and be safe. I don't feel safe, completely safe, but I know I'll try to surround myself with the right people that will advise me all the time what to do in case of emergency. But Mazen did not have those people around him all the time. So he psychologically, he was broken because he did not see the changes he wished to see when he came to the US. When I came to the Congress, I met some congressmen, I testified in the Senate. I was so hopeful, because, the powerful people in the world, they're listening to me. Everything gonna change. They're gonna follow the regime. All prisoners gonna be out. And you testify and you go back home, you sleep very well. You wake up the other day, and a few months later, 1 year later, nothing happened. All the congressmen, the senators will come and shake hands and say, Omar, that's powerful. We all should take responsibility. And yeah, words. We need more actions. Thank you, Josh.
Amen. Thank you, Omar. Let me go back to Qutaiba now. The whole world is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, and it's forced us all to look inward. And unfortunately, the walls between our countries have been built rather than taken down due to the virus and the tragedy that it spreads. But we don't often hear about what it's like inside Syria. Tell us how the COVID pandemic has affected the crisis there. What is the situation for the innocent people in places like Idlib and Deir el-Zor, but also how has the Assad regime abused the pandemic to perpetrate its horrendousness?
Of course, thank you, Josh. Unfortunately, COVID hit hardest in areas like Syria, especially in areas in northern Syria and Idlib and other places. Because, for Syrians in their daily life, if you're not able to secure your daily food put on the table, secure shelter for your children, or protect yourself from, indiscriminate bombardment coming from the skies, COVID or protection from COVID is the latest thing on anyone's mind, to be honest. At the beginning, I remember mid-time at the pandemic, the cost of just one disposable mask in Syria was almost 1,000 Syrian pounds at a time where basically you can buy, $1 of mass with a 1 month salary. That is something that no one can afford, let Syrians themselves do it. So it has been really drastic. Personally for us, we talk, on daily basis with Syrians inside in regime areas or in Northwest and Northeast. And on daily basis in my conversations, I always have to start with sending my condolences to the people I talk to, because I hear of their relatives, their family members, or their best friends who have died because of COVID. What of course have made this thing worse is the lack of management, at least to say, by the Assad regime, by the Assad government. Even before the uprising, what led us to the uprising was the mismanagement of the Assad regime. Not only on because of the lack of freedoms or the lack of management politically, the lack of liberal rights, but also the lack of management and care for Syrians in general. In 2007 and 2008, Syria was hit with one of the hardest droughts in 100 years. And people were literally starving in East Aleppo province and in Deir ez-Zor. What was the government response at the time? They organized an event for Guinness record for the longest kebab in the world, at the same time where people were starving to death. So we see that continuously throughout the last 10 years. The regime, instead of using chlorine to clean hospitals and clinics, it used it to actually produce chemical weapons to kill people instead of helping them. And those policies continue to be in place. During the pandemic, the government basically put punishment on doctors who would report any case of COVID officially without sending reference to the Ministry of Health. So doctors have to say that if you have COVID symptoms, then it's just an asthma, or it's it's some type of flu, that you couldn't even report if this is COVID or not. And that actually explains the lack of the low official numbers the Syrian government is reporting when it comes to COVID. In other areas, if we want to compare, to be honest, organizations like the White Helmets have been doing enormous job in fighting the pandemic, providing care to people, providing protection as much as they can, to the extent that it is actually permissible in a situation where you have crowded refugee camps, or where people, as I said, are looking for their daily food to put on the table.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Muaz Mustafa from the Syrian Emergency Task Force to come in here and talk about specifically the situation on the ground in Idlib. Muaz.
Thank you, Josh. We recently at the Syrian Emergency Task Force released, and happy to share it with whoever would like it, a list of 7 policy recommendations that we're utilizing in advocacy. At the top of that list is, the United States leading to get to a negotiated settlement and an end to the killing in Syria. And at the top of that list is the protection of Idlib. And the reason that Idlib is so high on the list is because I just want everyone to remember that in Northwest Syria, Idlib represents all of Syria. People from Aleppo and Damascus and Homs and Deir ez-Zor and Dar'a that were shipped in green buses when they didn't kneel to Assad, or escaping detention or killing or forced conscription went there. And so Idlib's population is double the size of its original residents. And in Idlib right now, it's an ever-shrinking space surrounded by Iran and its backed militias, including Hezbollah and a list of others that we can also provide, as well as the Russian military and air force and the Assad regime forces. What's really important to remember about Idlib, it's not merely about the fact that it will likely be the earliest test of the Biden administration, and also the fact that it has the highest risk of mass atrocities that will dwarf other mass atrocities we've seen even in Syria in the past 10 years. It also has the ability to double the refugees in Europe. It will also, if taken by the Assad regime, will allow Assad, Russia, and Iran to focus wholeheartedly on hurting our US troops and partner forces in order to pressure a withdrawal from Syria. But most importantly, if we allow Assad to kill, detain, or displace the millions of civilians, 1 million of them kids in Idlib province, that would essentially be the death knell of any potential political solution that would result in exactly what Ambassador Hoff described as the North Korea of the Middle East, because then the Assad regime can declare victory and wait out US withdrawal. And then the Assad regime, we have at the same time will be able to not be held accountable for the crimes. None of the refugees will ever return to regime-held areas, and now they won't even have Idlib to return to. And so it actually hurts that number one negotiated settlement if we let Idlib go. At the same time, if we protect Idlib, not meaning deploying troops or engaging in a major military intervention, we have Turkey, a NATO ally that has been okay with sending its own troops. It lost 33 or 34 service men from the Turkish military, NATO military, this time last year, trying to stop this big military offensive, which, by the way, resulted in this tentative ceasefire that's continuously being breached. We must make clear diplomatically and with our allies, the Europeans and Turkey, in this case in Northwest Syria, that the people in the protection of people in Idlib is something we will not sort of waver on. At the same time, ensuring that the sanctions through targeted executive orders and the Syria Civilian Protection Act are focused in a way that it hurts the Assad regime's ability to finance that military operations in Idlib. And I think at the end, and in doing both of these things and in providing logistics and intelligence to our NATO allies on the ground, we can, without military intervention, make clear that Idlib is, for lack of a better word, a red line. And that will be conducive to a negotiated settlement. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Moaz. This next question comes from the audience, from Greg Shea. I'm going to call on Ambassador Hoff to answer it. So get ready, Ambassador Hoff. The question is, what is the role of the ICC in addressing the Syrian situation in the International Criminal Court? And if Biden can change, it's a two-part question, if Biden can change the status of Venezuelan refugees, could he do the same for Syrian refugees? So I guess two questions there, the ICC and what can the Biden administration do for refugees?
My suspicion, Josh, is that the ICC probably will not be a critical player on the accountability front. I think the most important priority for the Biden administration right now is to reinforce our own accountability evidence and accountability activities in terms of making sure that that evidence is secured, and also making it clear to the Russians right now that the days of U.S. passivity in the face of regime mass atrocity activities, those days are over. That the United States, if faced with mass homicide activities by the regime, whether in Idlib or somewhere else, the United States will respond militarily at times and places of its choosing. I think we need to make this very clear up front. One thing we can give the Trump administration credit for in its military responses to two chemical assaults is that it did not lead to invasion, occupation, World War III, or any of the things we were constantly warned about during the Obama administration. We need to say never again, and we need to mean it this time.
Excellent, thank you, sir. It's worth noting here that Syria is not a party to the ICC, and therefore, in order to be subject to it, a referral would be needed from the UN Security Council, and Russia would surely veto any referral. Let me go now to Naomi and ask her to follow up on this issue of justice and accountability. What does history tell us about the importance of truth and justice and accountability for war crimes as it relates to the goal of peace, but more importantly, what will we see in this century if there's no justice and accountability and punishment for the atrocities in Syria today?
Thanks, Josh. As I mentioned, we know that the victims themselves will not rest until those who have committed crimes are held responsible. And core to the mission of the museum is to try to do for communities today what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust. That includes ensuring that individuals like Omar and others are able to have a seat at the table to identify how justice can be pursued. You just mentioned the challenges with the ICC. We have other avenues that are available. We're seeing countries hold individuals who are resident in those countries. They might have come as refugees, they might have immigrated, responsible for perpetrating crimes against humanity. We've now seen that happen in Germany with the first successful case where an individual was held responsible as being an accessory to the commission of those crimes for torture. We have other cases that are underway. We have cases that are being taken forward through universal jurisdiction. The Canadian government just recently reiterated a call for the UN General Assembly to, through the UN Convention Against Torture, examine the different ways to hold the Assad regime accountable. So we're seeing growing momentum, not just from survivors, but also from governments that are willing to extend the political will to hold Assad responsible. So I think what the future looks like, what the next few decades look like, is that the Assad regime, much like the former Nazis who tried to flee, are going to have to be looking over their shoulder every single day, wondering whether or not they will be picked up as they travel abroad, if change occurs within the country, whether or not they're going to be held responsible in domestic courts, ideally, or in regional courts that are developed. Because I think that though we have seen a failure to act in terms of stopping the killing, what we continue to see is sustained investment in collecting evidence, preserving evidence, analyzing that, building cases, and then as soon as there are opportunities for cases, that material is being used to hold people accountable. So governments are putting the money and now increasingly their political will behind trying to find avenues to prosecute abroad and making sure that we have the evidence needed so that in 10 years, 20 years, 60 years, people will be held responsible. And what do we know about what that means for societies? We know that unless a society reckons with its past, unless it comes to term and acknowledges the commission of crimes, we will only see either a continued tearing of the social fabric between different communities or the risk of recurrence. What happened in Syria did not start with the uprising. The commission of torture that Sam, Omar, Qutaiba, others have spoken about was a pattern of behavior that Assad used, Assad's father used. Assad's father was able to do so without any consequences. We cannot allow his son to continue to get away with these crimes today. And I think that that is what the future will, we're gonna see innovation, we're gonna see new avenues for justice. And I really truly believe that this is one area where there is a bit of a ray of hope and a bit of a silver lining too, because the rest of the world will benefit from those innovations that are made when it comes to justice and accountability in the context of Syria. But again, it's born off the backs of the Syrian people themselves, their experiences and their efforts to document, smuggle out the evidence. They're the ones whose lives are on the line to even pursue this work that is being done on justice and accountability.
Well, there you have it. Without an end to the atrocities, there can be no end to the war. And without truth and justice and accountability, there can be no sustainable peace. To those in the audience, it's not too late. Thank you for listening, but please do not turn away from this never again moment. For those in Syria, you are not forgotten. Thank you all for participating.